Welcome back to Age of Empires 4. This is my Age of Empires 4 tier list after spending 1 week with the fully released version of the game. First and foremost, we're going to smash straight into it just like we smashed the like button and start with the Rus. One of my favourite civs, and I'll try not to let my personal biases get in the way. What's the deal with Rus? Well, in general, they have lots of great options, and in my personal opinion is as they move towards the later game, they become even stronger still. I think they have one of the best, particularly Imperial Age abilities to compose a really powerful army, and also actually to reflect a little bit on the early game, their powerful early knights and their bounty hunter ability stops a lot of thumb twiddling with your villagers in the early game. For me, the Rus are very powerful indeed. I'm tossing up between the S tier and the A tier, and I think I'm going to place them at a low S. It's really close, just so you know, but I'm going to go with a low S. Next up, I'd like to tackle the not holy, not Roman, and not really an empire. It's Holy Roly. Holy Roly to me is a real middle-of-the-road, well-rounded civ in Age of Empires 4. Relatively easy to play. In my opinion, nothing super outstanding or super overpowered, but a fairly well-rounded mix of economy, of military, and of trade. You can go cavalry, range, or infantry, in my experience, fairly easily with the Holy Rollies. And overall, I think that when you factor in a reasonable man-at-arms rush strategy, it places them at what I would consider to be a high B tier. An average, but perhaps on the higher end of that average, and I'll try and reflect that as I place further civs down the line. Next up, we have the Chinese. And to be honest, the Chinese are one that I've probably had maybe the least experience with, but I think I still have a reasonable feel for how they're placed in relation to everything else. I think that the Chinese are, relatively speaking, a harder civ to play in Age of Empires 4, particularly early on. There are some interesting nuances around the whole, two landmarks into the next dynasty dynamic, and boy oh boy will you be hit with a lot of text around the dynasties. I think that the Chinese are good later on, and they have some powerful siege potential, but their lack of economic bonuses make them difficult to play in the early game, and in particular I find that they can be a little bit outpaced, and I've been on both ends of that. As I say, my experience with them is relatively limited, but I think that my understanding is reasonably sound, and for that reason I'm going to place them at a C tier, middle of the road C tier ranking. Next up, we have the Abbasid Dynasty, and they're a really fascinating one because of the way that their unique research upgrades come out of their House of Wisdom, and the wider role that the House of Wisdom plays for the Abbasid Dynasty. I think that they're a slightly different civ because of that, and it makes them not impossible to compare, but I feel like they're almost working in sort of their own separate list, maybe alongside perhaps the Chinese or Delhi, right? And that sort of outside of the box, but also familiar experience from them, I think. I think that the Abbasid Dynasty suffers a little bit from the Chinese experience as well, in that they're slightly harder to get going early on. However, I do consider them to be a pretty good anti-cavalry option in Age of Empires 4. Maybe one of the better, actually, if not the best, counter-cavalry options. It is for that reason that I'll place the Abbasid Dynasty at a B-tier ranking. Next, we have the English. Oh, sweet English. Their longbows are incredible, and there are some really gimmicky, ridiculous combinations with longbows attacking town centers accompanied by siege units and other formidable sort of battering ram style units. It's ridiculous. The longbows are very strong. I think overall, though, if I sort of step aside from my wonderful experience with the longbows, the English are a cheap, easy, well-rounded civ to play, and that's reflected in their 1-star difficulty rating, of course. Maybe they're slightly weak to siege, but it's hard to find many drawbacks from this well-rounded, really staple civilization, not only for Age of Empires, but for other strategy games across the board. The English longbow is notorious for its strength, and Age of Empires 4 doesn't disappoint on that front. I don't think that the English are necessarily top tier, but man, I've been grappling with this. This is actually my third take at this English cut, not because I ballsed up any of the words, but because I put them in S tier, then I put them at A tier, and I thought, no, you know what, I'm gonna do this once more and just see how I can convince myself as I'm thinking about them and talking about them. And I think I'm going to settle at a very high A-tier ranking. To me, these two are very similar, the English and the Rus, in terms of overall power level, but in terms of how they play, they're very different. I think the English tend to be easier for the average player, a little bit more simple to play, but I think that the Rus overpower them overall, assuming that we have a reasonable level of efficacy and efficiency with both of them. Next up, we have the Franks, or sorry, should I say the French? Technically, they're referred to as the French. So, the French are actually very similar to the English, and therefore makes sense that they both have their 1-star difficulty ratings. They are easy and cheap to play. Moreover, I think that though the French really have a fantastic economy. They have such a fantastic economy. All of their bonuses are brilliant. Everything becomes cheaper, and most things become more efficient and effective. Trade, no problem. Military, no problem. Units, no problem. Upgrades and buildings, no problem. The French are absolutely fantastic. I think they are also maybe stronger at sea maps than some of the other more straightforward civs to play. I haven't massively tested it. I have to admit I rage quit out of a couple of sea match games, but I really do like the French, and I think they are absolutely probably the best civ in Age of Empires 4 at the moment. Somebody sound the alarm, because out come the Mongols. One of my favourite civs to play because of just how different and unique they are. The Mongols are a widely variable, but to be fair, harder to play civ. They are APM heavy, with someone like me who has a couple of minor physical restrictions in my APM does make it more difficult for me to play them, I admit. However, I think you can open early and strong, and anybody who knows anything about the Mongols will agree with me. The rush with your horses obviously is nearly unparalleled. Their trade and economy can also snowball too. I think that looking at them at face value as these, pillaging nomads doesn't really give the full description of what is actually a very strong but also profitable civ. It is for that reason that I rank the Mongols at an A tier, but with a slight asterisk caveat in that, in my mind, the jump between the English and the Mongols is probably the most significant jump out of any of these pairings that we already have formed, right? I think that this difference, this gap here, is more significant than, say, this gap between these two or this gap between my two S-tier civs. The point that I'm trying to bring across here is that there is, in my opinion, a significant power difference between the English and the Mongols, but not significant enough to warrant moving them between or outside of the A tier. And last, and potentially least, sorry, it's the Delhi Sultanate. The Delhi Sultanate is another civ in Age of Empires 4 that really warrants its difficulty ranking, I think. Not because I've necessarily personally struggled with understanding them or even playing them, but just particularly at this relatively early stage in Age of Empires 4's development. It hasn't been unleashed to the public for very long. A more complex civ like Delhi may take more time for us to truly understand its power rankings. My understanding of Delhi is that they are certainly harder to play, and their unique mechanics make them more difficult still. They can gather sacred sites earlier than most, if not all, and of course their scholars play a big role in how you research and develop moving forwards. Their elephants, and boy do I love a good elephant unit, are very strong, but also very weak. And what I mean by that is, while they're noteworthy, they're really, firstly, one of your only tricks, and secondly, a trick that is quite slow to get. Forgive the elephant movement pun. It seems to me like the elephants are fantastic, but they just don't get there in time. You can be outpaced and outclassed by a lot of the other specializations that most of the other civs on screen have. It is for that reason, I'm afraid, that the Delhi Sultanate for me is a D tier civ. I would happily also put it in the C tier as well, just so you know. I consider this jump, unlike our last one, this one to be one of the closest jumps between tier rankings. And I will admit, and full disclosure, I do not have a lot of experience with Delhi either. And their complexities will probably mean that as the game progresses, we'll probably see them moving up to around a B tier, I would predict. But at the moment, I think they are a D tier civ. And that concludes my Age of Empires 4 tier list. Thank you very much for watching. Of course, I don't need to ask, but I would love to hear your feedback in the comments below if you'd like to share it with me. I'm sure there are a couple of these that I'll be dragged over the coals for placing in the wrong position, too low, and likewise probably too high, but I'd like to hear about it nonetheless. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.